War. War never changes.
Some kind of war junkie?
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
Welcome to the War 102 podcast, where we explore the doctrine, theory, philosophy, and history of warfare. I'm your guide, Paul Darling, and I want to share what I learned in nearly 30 years in uniform. So let's get to learning about the most influential activity in human history, war. Welcome to episode 52, the Algerian Civil War and Islamic Insurgencies. This episode was a request from a listener, and at first I was a bit befuddled. There are some interesting aspects to it, admittedly. From this stems two classics of books on war, the fictional Centurions by Jean Lartigue, and the only slightly less fictional Galula's counterinsurgency warfare. The former was made into a movie called The Lost Command, which wasn't a bad adaptation. The latter was made into a 20-year war in Afghanistan, which we lost. I recommend the former, not so much the latter. The war itself is known by several different names: the Algerian War, the Algerian Revolution, the Algerian War of Independence. All such names are largely dependent upon your political ideology. First, of course, a little background on Algeria. It is, since Sudan was carved in half, the largest country in Africa. It is in North Africa and thus separated from the rest of Africa by the massive Saharan Desert, which encompasses the vast majority of Algeria. North Africa is known as the Maghreb, meaning simply west in Arabic. In more ancient times, the region was known as Africa Minor. The inhabitable and greener northern part is separated from the desolate Sahara by the Atlas mountain chain, stretching from the Atlantic coast in Morocco to Tunisia. These are not insignificant hills. Many peaks are above 12,000 feet. The Atlas Mountains are further subdivided into various chains. To sum up for the purposes here, while the vast majority of Algeria is little different than what you might think of the Arabian Desert, the parts of Algeria that matter, and that the war went on in, are very mountainous, urban coastal plains, and surprisingly fertile and green valleys. This was not Lawrence of Arabia. As with the entire coastline of the Mediterranean basin, the land has been inhabited since prehistoric times, and while ancient Carthage was in what is now modern-day Tunisia, Algeria was certainly part of the greater Carthaginian Empire. Phoenicians, Romans, even Vandals, Byzantines all inhabited portions, usually along the coast. And, of course, the Arab conquest brought the ancient land under Arab and Muslim control. Always there, but usually inhabiting the mountain areas, are the ancient Berbers, themselves divided into ethnic groups. Non-Berbers see them as one people. The Berbers themselves do not. Derivatives of the name stretch into ancient Egyptian times, but the etymology stretches from barbarian, the Barbary coast, and Barbary pirates, while themselves Arabs and not Berbers receive their name from them. From the Muslim conquest in the early 8th century, there has been constant friction from the Muslim south and Christian north. Slave raids emanated from the Maghreb coastal communities such as Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli. Europeans who converted or simply wanted to be pirates joined these Muslim communities, bringing modern sailing and fighting techniques, which greatly increased their frequency and efficacy. Well over 1 million southern Europeans are believed to have been enslaved. Their raids were so frequent and brutal that many ancient coastal communities in France, Italy, and Spain were abandoned. Following the defeat of Napoleon, the now freed-up militaries agreed at the Congress of Vienna to finally crush the Barbary pirates. The U.S., uninvolved, thankfully, in the various Napoleonic campaigns, were early to this fight. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson insisting famously on an expensive navy, but, quote, not one penny to tribute. The pirates often demanded a tribute to ensure free shipping through the Mediterranean. But, to the point of this episode, it was the French who carried the largest burden and ultimately conquered the Maghreb, and specifically Algeria, in 1830, and ultimately took Algeria as a colony. Not long after, in 1848, Algeria was declared not just a colony, but actually part of France, no different than Burgundy or Brittany. Many French and other Europeans settled there were known colloquially as the Pieds Noirs, or Blackfeet, owing most likely to the black leather shoes they wore. European descendants eventually comprised 20% of Algeria's population. There is an interesting and not entirely casual linkage from the U.S. State Department's abandonment of Chiang Kai-shek in favor of Mao Zedong in China to the events in Algeria. In the absence of communist China, there would have been no Korean War, and the Viet Minh, the communist insurgents fighting against the French in Indochina, or Vietnam if you prefer, could not have been victorious without the end of the Korean War freeing up Chinese and Soviet support. And there can be little doubt that the timing of the start of the Algerian War of Secession was inspired by the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu only months prior. The Arab rebels were generally part of the National Liberation Front, known as the FLN, but as with most such wars, there were numerous groups vying for leadership and future control who spent as much time fighting each other as the French. The FLN explicitly meant to model their strategy with the Chinese and Vietnamese communists. Their strategy was simply to exhaust the French into abandoning Algeria and leaving it, much as they were doing in North Vietnam. To do so, they would not directly counter the French military, rather attack the civilian pieds noirs and thus goad the French into military action, hoping upon sympathetic figures in both the communist camp worldwide, as well as a sympathetic and large French communist and socialist community, disproportionately represented in the French media. It was a sound strategy which, though it took 8 years, worked. The first attack on 1 November was 70 separate raids by FLN fighters against civilian and police targets. As predicted, the government in Paris deployed 600 gendarmes to Algeria to squash the rebellion. A quick side note, gendarmes is a militarized police unit organized into traditional military organizations of companies and battalions. It has no equivalent in the American military or civilian law enforcement. As only 10 French civilians were murdered in the attack, it received scant attention in the news. With the open declaration of the intent to seize independence through violence, several other groups of note cropped up. The Democratic Union of Algerian Manifesto, the Algerian Communist Party, of course, the Association of Algerian Muslims, and the Algerian National Movement. These organizations all had groups in Algeria as well as mainland France. In fact, thousands were killed in inter-fighting in France itself that largely ignored the French population. C'est la guerrilla, indeed. The early fighting, if you can call it that, focused on attacking pied noir farming communities far from the main cities of Algiers and Oran, which were majority European in population. While few deaths resulted from these raids, it did denude the rural areas of Europeans, ethnic cleansing, if you will, but it wasn't making much headway outside of that. And, even worse, the French military was largely ignoring these raids and merely provided protection to the large cities. The FLN needed a massive body count of Arabs to provide the outrage necessary to achieve their objectives. With that, the FLN decided on a coordinated attack on specifically civilian targets and, ideally, with such brutality as to ensure the French military had to respond. In August 1955, the FLN struck near the town of Philippeville, which killed over 100 civilians, the majority women and children. Rape and mutilation were encouraged and largely broadcasted. As predicted and wanted, the French responded with massive retaliations, killing over 1,000 suspected FLN fighters. Naturally, the FLN reported 10 times that number as actually dead. As repeated over and over in this podcast, it didn't matter if it was true. It only mattered that the communist and socialist papers in France reported it as such, which they dutifully did. It must be remembered that the French government at the time, the Fourth Republic, was socialist, and owing to the post-World War II feelings of revolution and anti-colonialism, was inherently sympathetic to the FLN, but the atrocities were too much to ignore. As the FLN was largely ignored up until now, they were able to operate within Algeria with impunity, always ahead of the security forces, with little trouble, and the French gendarmes unwilling to venture into the mountains and hills increasingly devoid of Europeans. But now they were hunted, and the leadership split between the external leadership, mostly located in Tunisia, and the what was called internals fighting within Algeria. This caused massive friction that, if properly exploited, might have ended the rebellion, or at least delayed it. Our old friend Nasser, newly crowned as leader of Egypt, was providing the bulk of the FLN's military hardware. This was no small reason France leapt, pardon the expression, at retaking the Suez Canal only a year later. In fact, by 1957, the FLN was losing. They turned to their Arab and communist allies in the UN to put increasing pressure on the French government. Every captured FLN fighter was declared an innocent civilian, every detainment labeled torture. No matter how egregious the action by the Arab insurgency, it was always explained away as the inevitable result of colonist brutality. Further complicating matters was that, as Algeria was part of France, the FLN was comprised of Frenchmen who soundly denounced the loss of their civil rights while simultaneously denouncing and attacking the country that granted them. The hypocrisy is obvious as well as irrelevant. They own the message. But it still wasn't enough. They needed to provoke the French even more, so they turned to bombings in large cities, deliberately targeting French civilians. Outside the cities, nearly all attacks were against police or civilian targets, and then blending into the Arab population. This had now become a familiar guerrilla campaign, with mobility being king and merely a question of how quickly the guerrillas could flee and how quickly the counterinsurgents could pursue. The French use of helicopters here were the first for real tactical mobility and provided tactics and techniques which would provide the basis for future counterinsurgencies in Vietnam, Rhodesia, Malaysia, and elsewhere. Another technique used was that of pseudo-terrorists, where French-supporting ethnic Algerians would infiltrate FLN formations as both spies, as well as to sow discord and distrust. These techniques are highly effective, and hundreds of FLN leaders were executed by their own on the mere suspicion of treachery. The Rhodesian Silas scouts would copy this tactic to their own success later. With the mountains being less secure with the high mobility provided the French helicopters, the FLN base in Tunisia became a focus of attention. Much like the Taliban retreating to Pakistan to refit and rearm, the FLN did the same with Tunisia. The French created an electrified border fence along the entire 200-mile border, replete with landmines and barbed wire, which proved highly effective. Even though almost 500,000 French military were dedicated to the efforts in Algeria, this still wasn't enough. Borrowing from the British in South Africa, they created massive concentration camps where Algerian villagers were removed from the remote villages and placed in these camps. The optics of this tactic were terrible, even though they created factories and provided housing to the displaced farmers. But it was enough for the French to gain the upper hand, and by 1959, the FLN, as an effective fighting force, no longer existed. The socialists ruling France in the Fourth Republic eventually fell, and an entirely new constitution and government replaced them, led by Charles de Gaulle, the decidedly anti-communist and, well, anti-everyone not French general. He had toured Algeria earlier, declaring dramatically and worthlessly, "I have understood you," to both the Pieds and Arabs. The new constitution gave far more expansive rights to the Muslim Arabs, allowing both men and women to vote, and de Gaulle was now trapped in an impossible situation. Either the Algerians were truly French, or they were not. If they were, then nothing could stop them from moving into France, which millions would have in a heartbeat. And if they were not, then this was just another colonial war, and the French communists and socialists, humiliated by the fall of the Fourth Republic, were itching to bring down de Gaulle and to use Algeria as the millstone to drag him under the waves of public sentiment. De Gaulle realized that Algeria was a lost cause and made clear his intent to abandon her to the Arab nationalist demands. The Pieds Noirs and soldiers who had fought were furious and staged numerous protests in Algiers and elsewhere. Ultimately, they attempted an insurrection, assuming the support of the military, which failed to materialize. The FLN, militarily impotent at this point, stood back and gleefully watched French forces destroy themselves. By 1961, de Gaulle was secretly negotiating with the FLN to determine merely the level of humiliation France would suffer. The FLN, realizing victory was at hand, was more concerned that other independence groups were excluded. They were consolidating their power looking to the future. In fact, the war would have ended a full year earlier if not for the FLN's insistence that they alone represent Algeria. Knowing the end was near, rather than tone down the violence, the terrorism against the Pieds Noirs was amplified with bombings and throat-slitting murders becoming even more common. The OAS, an organization of Frenchmen who sought to retain Algeria, tried to provoke the Muslims and cause a revolution internal to Algeria, essentially copying the FLN's tactics of 8 years earlier. But it failed. The FLN realized at this point dead Arabs was to their benefit and only amplified their international justification. A protest by Pieds Noirs over the predicament was met by a slaughter of over 300 French civilians by the French military. The gleeful amplification of this by the socialist press only encouraged the mainland French to vote to dissolve the union of France and Algeria. The ultimate agreement, known as the Evian Accords, gave the Pieds a 3-year grace period, after which they would either become Algerians or relocate to France. It turned out 3 years was far more than was needed, as with the withdrawal of French military forces, the FLN was free to terrorize the Pieds as they had achieved their objectives and had zero fear of any international condemnation. As such, over 1 million Pieds and almost the entire Jewish community of Algeria fled to France in a mere span of months. As with so many counterinsurgencies, tactically the French were superior. The centers of gravity for the French were the security of the European majority cities of Algiers and Oran, which they managed to isolate and protect fairly well. The sine qua non for the weaker military power of the insurgents is always their safe haven. The superior mobility of the helicopter and truck-borne French forces managed to ensure the FLN were largely incapable of massing enough force to do militarily significant attacks without being found and destroyed. While their bases in Tunisia were safe, the border defense strategy of the French ensured they couldn't move freely back and forth, and effectively those forces in Tunisia were out of the fight. Finally, their ability to use rural Arab villages was removed as the 2 million Arabs relocated to the concentration camps drained the sea they had hoped to swim in, as Mao would dictate. These pseudo-terrorist strategies proved highly successful in undermining the FLN's cohesion. These tactics were very successful in nearly all counterinsurgencies against communist forces. But at the policy level, the French were weak. France being the heart of Western European socialism, there was already significant political weakness, as much of the French population and far more of its postmodernist-inspired leadership were frankly pro-FLN. The entire Soviet bloc was firmly in the FLN's camp, and the Western-backed monarchies of the Arab world were being replaced with similarly inspired Arab nationalist socialist movements, such as Nasser's Egypt and the various Ba'athist states. The policy objectives of isolating the French government were dependent explicitly on a strategy of terrorism directed against French civilians in Algeria. The strategy had two objectives. First was to cause them to flee Algeria and abandon the country entirely through abject fear of their lives. In this they failed. The second was to lure the French into fighting and then level accusations of torture, civilian deaths, and bad general behavior, and use the accusations, whether true or not, as ammunition to feed their allies in the UN and the media. In this, they were fabulously successful, and they developed a model which continues to be used today, most recently in Gaza. All fighting involves destruction, and when one side refuses to wear uniforms and whose strategy is to magnify civilian deaths, the opportunity, provided a sympathetic information infrastructure, to undermine the position of the enemy is there. The lesson of Algeria is ultimately, when embarking upon a counterinsurgency against an enemy dedicated to terrorist tactics, you must be politically capable of withstanding the inevitable accusations of war crimes as long as required. An enemy whose strategy demands maximum civilian casualties, both their own and others, would ordinarily be at an informational warfare disadvantage. I think Western countries are far too reticent to highlight this callous calculus, and the media, sympathetic to one side, makes it difficult to do so regardless. At the operational level, isolating the insurgent from their safe havens, whether internal or external, must be the first priority. And, obviously, at the tactical level, rapidity of movement and decision-making must make punishing the insurgent at every opportunity the priority. Killing insurgents doesn't make more insurgents, and only idiots state such. It's whether you can control the messaging against a highly biased informational environment. The failure of Hamas in copying these tactics is, in Algeria, the French had a place to retreat to. Hamas refuses to accept the Jewish connection to Israel, insisting they are a European colonial power rather than an indigenous people returned to their historic homeland. As such, their informational leverage is far weaker. The Israeli people will not abandon Israel to return to Europe or the various Arab countries from which they were expelled. But, to their credit, it's all they have. They are far too weak to militarily defeat the IDF, and, committed to the destruction of Israel, they fight in the only manner available to them. But it's obvious at this point peace is impossible. They are replicating the strategy of the FLN, but the conditions are not the same. I don't think Hamas accepts this, or, at least, is willing to admit it. So here we are. And this concludes my first year of this podcast. I guess I'll keep it going, with no small amount of thanks, again, to my subscribers. Chris, George, Dennis, Brian, Ken, Paul, Jeff, Dave, and William. Apparently, war doesn't really entice the female listeners. My intent is to use the funds you have graciously provided to do some paid advertising and try to expand the listener base. Please contact me for any recommendations for future episodes, and, sticking with the Maghreb for now, join me next week as we will look at the torch landings in World War II. Thanks for joining us today. If you liked what you heard, please like, subscribe, rate, and comment. Most importantly, share with your friends. Join the conversation at the War 102 subreddit, and check out the War 102 Buzzsprout website for links to more information and supporting videos. Send me an email at war102podcast@gmail.com. I look forward to your comments and hope you join us again next week. See you then.